conservative societies, where the dominant narrative is religious dogma, where religion permeates every single aspect of society, there is no room for discourse, there is no room for logic, we think that this is extremely harmful. Why? Because the tradition and cultural forces of this conservative society absolutely resist change of any sort. They feel that change of any sort goes against their religion. Anybody that opts for this change is going to hell, and therefore they're never ever going to opt for this change. There is no discussion on the merits or demerits of certain issues in society. For example, the LGBT rights. Because it goes against their religion, it goes against their beliefs, right? So they're never ever going to support it because they think it goes against their religion. We think this is not logical, we think this is extremely dogmatic. And because of this, they will never ever vote for liberal politicians. Why? Because this now perpetuates the vicious cycle of oppression and discrimination of minorities. I've been told you about LGBT rights, how it goes against their religion, therefore they're never ever going to support it. Furthermore, it's going to go on for generations. Because of the social and structural inertia, the mindset is already ossified, was passed down from generation to generations. And so these people will never ever change their thinking. For example, in Saudi Arabia, right, where there is systematic oppression of women's rights, where women were not allowed to vote, not allowed to have rights to education. Even when that girl who wrote the book, okay, even when she wrote the book, she was rejected by her own society because her own society could not accept that women had equal rights as men. Because of these conservative societies not having an open mindset, we think it's extremely harmful to them. We think that in dire situations such as this, there's an absolute necessity for liberal politicians who want to get into power to lie. Why do we think that is different from liberal democracy? Because in liberal democracies, sit down, there is room for discourse. The discourse we're talking about is positive discourse that propagates awareness and understandings of issues in society. Sit down. We think that in conservative societies, when the kind of discourse you're propagating is how it is so bad against religion, how you must never opt into it, and therefore people will subscribe to this religion and not opt for these liberal politicians anyway, right? But because we think this cannot happen in conservative societies, but we do understand that conservative societies need to have an injection of liberal values. Therefore, politicians who do support liberal policies need to lie about it. What do we think by lying? For example, if a politician supports gay rights, if he supports gay rights and pushing for gay-friendly policies, he's allowed to lie about it, say he is not going to support gay policies during his propaganda. We think it is justified. We think this is a value judgment debate. We don't really need a model to do so. I have 2 points of substantiation for you, but before that, yes.
Conservatism is not only an institutional issue, but also a societal issue. Insofar as you characterize religion as a dominant dogma within these nations, how are you going to, in the long run, change people to make them more liberal?
We think that this change, because of the characterization that society is never ever going to change, the change has to happen from the top down. The change has to happen from the government. If the government never changes, society is never ever going to change. They already conceded to that. So let's look at my first substantive. Why is this such a dire necessity for change? Sit down. We need to understand conservative societies, right? I already told you how the dominant narrative is religious dogma. It's been held for generations, but just because people have been doing it for so long doesn't mean it's good. Just because that generation held it forever doesn't mean it's right. For example, just because women have been systematically oppressed and be denied the rights to education, denied the rights to vote, doesn't mean it's right. Furthermore, just because people think that being gay is wrong doesn't mean it's right. Because people think that gay people are going to hell, right? They think it's their duty as society to lynch them, to punish them. We don't think this is good in any way. This is systematic oppression of minority rights. We need to make a change for it. Furthermore, because people have never been exposed to an alternative view, they've never been exposed to the viewpoint that maybe women are equal to men, that maybe women, maybe LGBTs have the same rights as us, because they've never been exposed to that particular point of view, they're never ever going to change themselves. They've been conditioned to accept this oppression by their parents, by society. They don't even know they're oppressed, ladies and gentlemen. We think it's extremely harmful. Therefore, they will never ever push for change themselves. The ossified religious dogmatics will stay in power. They will control societal discourse. They control societal mindsets. We think that because these people don't even know they're oppressed, they themselves are not going to fight for the politicians that's trying to support them, right? We think that this is the last course of action. There is no alternative. Because these politicians are not going to get the support from the people that they're trying to protect. They need to resort to desperate means. These liberal people, right? They tried social movement. They tried to push the gay movement, the LGBT movement, right? But society has rejected him. Society even used violence against them. We think that because of this liberal movement from the grassroots that tried to change things from the grassroots level has failed. Therefore, for the greater good, liberal politicians must lie. If they don't, change is never going to happen. The harms against the people will be continued. We think it's extremely harmful. But before I'm moving to my second point, yes.
There's a spectrum of conservative nations that exist. There are some nations, and we must recognize, that choose to remain conservative. Please prove to us what is the inherent good of changing from conservative to liberal.
We think that is necessary. We wonder, right, if their side is supporting oppression against women, is supporting oppression against minority rights. Because that is the thing that conservative societies are doing. We wonder if they're trying to do that. We as government we are fighting for minority rights. We think the oppression against them is wrong. But the second point is this. We think that the outcome justifies the means. When politicians lie about the stance on certain issues, it's easier for them to get into a position where they can effectively push for liberal policies, right? When they get into power, they can issue orders by executive fiat. For example, when Barack Obama, the President of the United States, went behind Congress's back to initiate the hostage swap with the Taliban, right? Because Congress was never going to agree to it anyway. Therefore, the President, in this case, can go behind Congress back in the interest of the greater good. We think is beneficial in that sense. Because minorities had never had representation to start with, now when these politicians lie to get into a position of power, they can get representative in government. They can empower their rights, they can protect them from harm. We think that, however, this is not an overnight process, but at least now there is a driving force in society, in the government, pushing for change. Any attack at any day is still better than the status quo, where religion continues to be the dominant narrative, where there is no room for discourse or logic. We think that when religious dogmatics keep rejecting change, change is never going to happen. For all those reasons, we're very proud to lie. Thank you.
Right, we thank the speaker for opening the debates, and we now invite the first speaker of opposition, the leader of opposition.
Side proposition is telling us a few things. They are first of all telling us that just because a nation is conservative, it is therefore immediately religious, it is therefore immediately oppressive. On top of that, they are telling us that definitely within these nations, having like progressive politics and progressive values, liberal values, is a definite good in a country where these people, they themselves say, right, don't even know what is wrong, might not necessarily want change in and of themselves, right? And finally, they're also telling us that this will ultimately work at the end of the day, it will ultimately solve the problem that they have set up for us. I'm going to engage with this in a few areas, but first of all, let's take a look at what we're going to present to you for today. I'm going to argue how, first of all, it is illegitimate for these politicians to do so, and second of all, how it's only going to be counterproductive towards their cause. And on our side, we think that there already exists some alternatives. So for instance, there are many Saudi Arabian women who are unveiling online. There are many Iranian women who are unveiling online. Because of the presence of such media, which is increasingly hard for the most autocratic of regimes to clamp down on, we therefore say it is possible, even in the most extreme situations, for such organic change to take root and take place. Furthermore, we also see that not all conservative nations are definitely as oppressive as theirs I would like to point to us, right? We argue that Malaysia, for instance, is a very clear example of a nation which is probably quite conservative, which is not entirely liberal or entirely fair or egalitarian, right? So for instance, like the Bumi Putra policy. However, we say that there still exists legitimate ways in which the political opposition can still garner the vote of the people legitimately, show that they still have got political support, and therefore garner change within that situation. We stand for such things on our side of the house. In the worst case of situations, we argue that boycotts, protests are still legitimate ways ways to show that you have the support of the people, to rally these people to fight for your cause in a situation where the system itself is corrupt. We do not think that these politicians should buy into that system. Two questions there on the other side of the house. Is that really legitimate, and will it really work, right? They brought to us the idea that minority rights are important, and that how we ultimately need to protect these people, we need to protect their basic rights. Yes, it is true, this is something that will definitely exist on both sides of the house, but they haven't really drawn to us the direct link as to why lying is therefore legitimate, right? Ultimately, their argument is premised on the assumption that a conservative nation is necessarily religious, is necessarily oppressive. I've really disproved that. But more importantly, in these nations, if these people don't even know that they want change, and we argue that they do in fact know, right? So for example, Saudi Arabian women, they do know that they want some form of freedom. But if we argue that in a situation where they don't know what this change really is, how can they place a value judgment and say that this is what is best and good for these people, right? Ultimately, we argue that the mandate of the people is what is most important. That what these people fundamentally believe in is most important. You have no right to go up there and tell people that this is what is best for you, especially since the values that these egalitarian politicians are fighting for is ultimately one that aims to support the rights of these people. Second question then, will it really work, right? And here's where we say that this is an important part of the debate. In a situation where they're telling us that this is a problem, that the problem is oppression, and we want to improve the problem of oppression. If we show you that on their side of the house, oppression in fact becomes worse or they do not solve it, then their principle falls to the outside of the house. They told us that these politicians, when they get into positions of power, will be able to push for liberal policies. I'm going to now disprove that in my substantives by showing you how they don't have legitimacy and only be counterproductive for them. So first of all, we argue that within these political systems, right, and in situations where there's a vote which has got some form of legitimacy at the very least, then representation and accountability is ultimately what's very important, right? We recognize that there's a spectrum of voters, some people who might be ambivalent, some people who might definitely want these liberal policies that their side wants to push for. In a situation in which these people are voting for politicians because they believe whatever these politicians are saying, the vote that they are putting in is ultimately what gives these politicians the mandate, right? Because I want this politician to represent me, I want them to be accountable to whatever policies I want, be it derived from my religious beliefs or whatever. And in such a situation, when these politicians are deceiving these voters, we argue that it's illegitimate because they need to be accountable for these voters in such a political system. Second of all, hold on a moment, we also argue that these politicians are ultimately dependent on the mandate of the people. How do you know that people want whatever policies you're pushing for if in the first place you have deceived the entire voter base? People do not know and did not have the chance to voice their support and vote for you and give you legitimacy. This legitimacy is especially important in a situation where these progressive politicians are ultimately fighting for the rights of these people at the very bottom, and therefore they need the mandate of the people, especially in the face of other politicians, like conservative politicians, might depend on the will of God. These people depend on the will of the people, they need the mandate of the people. Will you not agree?
Sir, how will then representation occur for those people on the ground who are being oppressed under your characterization, especially when these liberalist politicians never get voted into power in the first place?
So, sir, I've really provided you like a comprehensive list of alternatives at the very start of my speech, right? But beyond that, we also say that it's not our position in this debate to show you that we have any perfect alternative, because we don't really think a perfect alternative actually exists within this debate. But I'm going to show you now why on your side of the house it's only going to be counterproductive towards the building up of any support for your liberal policies on your side of the house, and that's why it's harmful, right? First of all, we think on their side, you undermine the support base because it's unable for you to build trust quickly among the liberal people within society, even if you want to bring up those policies for them. So if you have said one thing during the elections, and suddenly after you have voted in, you say another thing, and then you are shifting your stance, how are you going to get any form of credibility in the political arena? How are you going to gain any form of credibility, especially when there's a lot of opponents who are out there to get you at the moment you change your credibility, the moment you change your stance, right? Second of all, we also argue that this is worsened by the fact that there will be a huge conservative backlash on their side of the house. You might get in a position of power technically because you are elected, but that does not change the fact that the main reason why many of these religious politicians or leaders are in power in the first place is because of institutions which will still remain even after you're elected in power. We're talking about the media, we're talking about the courts, we're talking about positions like the Ayatollah in Iran, where you cannot be elected out of, right? These are all positions where conservative leaders still hold huge sway, hold huge power. They're only going to use the media to get at you, to remove you from power. They're only going to use all these institutions to undermine your credibility, undermine your power, disrupt the governance of these leaders, and this is only going to ensure that they are going to be unable to exact any policies that they want. In the worst case scenario, we also see that the backlash garnered from their side of the house will lead to a huge crackdown on any liberal politicians from doing ever such a thing again in the future. They only worsen the kinds of conservative dogmatism and the kinds of autocracy that exist within these countries. You make it harder for any liberal politicians and leaders to garner support in the future. For all these reasons, we are very proud to oppose.
Right, we thank the speaker for his speech. We now invite the second speaker from the government team, the Deputy Prime Minister.
Problem with side oppositions, we think there's too many mischaracterization coming from their side. They're assuming that these conservative societies are not religious and they're open up for discussions. And secondly, the problem with their side is they believe that somehow organic change will happen without even proving to us how this change will happen. We tell you that there needs to be a push for this change to happen. It will never happen under their side. Let me move on to my first rebuttal. They brought out the idea of how Saudi Arabia, they unveiled it in the media and in online. We tell you that the problem with this example is that the government there publicly shamed them in the media after they did this, right? We think this is harmful, but it shows that there's oppression towards their side, and all these other alternatives that they try to bring up is not going to work at the end of the day because it's proven in status quo, it's proven in the society right now. Secondly, the idea of representation that they want to bring up. The problem is the problem with this accountability or representation is this. They are not actually, these people on the ground are not actually making a choice, are not actually voting because they don't actually have the information to choose what they actually want. The problem why they don't have this information is because the governments right there are restricting the ability for this understanding to happen, and this is exactly what side opposition are perpetuating and entrenching on their side, right? We think that they're gambling on organic change, but we think that ours is more effective because our policy reaches and affects everyone once it comes to place when these politicians actually make a change in the legislation, right? And the last thing that I brought up was the idea of credibility. Look, we don't think what we care from our side is the image of these politicians. We think that what we care about is the change on the ground so that there's a reduce in oppression towards these minorities because that's what we want to achieve at the end of the day. And lastly, the mischaracterization that they brought up and how their whole case was contingent on this characterization and how these conservative societies are not so bad, how there's a spectrum. We tell you that these conservative societies are not so bad and there's room for discussion. This means that this society is not so conservative to begin with. That means that this society is already liberal because there's space for discussion. We think that the whole first speech there is not credible because they're banking on the wrong characterization, right? So first of all, let's look at the comparison between the liberal states and the conservative states because of this messy characterization that came out from their side. We think that the liberal states, what happens is the society is already open for all these liberal beliefs. There's a higher likeliness to accept a change even from the grassroots level, right? They're open up to other ideas, other external ideas, but in conservative societies, here's the comparison, they don't accept this kind of change. They're not open up for this kind of discussion. They reject this discussion. They don't even want to think about it. We think this is how it's harmful because in these conservative societies, they will not change by themselves unless an external force is acted onto them, and this is exactly what side government are providing today's debate. But before I move on, sure.
How is it fair for you to define all conservative nations as autocratic when clearly there are some nations such as Malaysia where the opposition is gaining ground, where they are able to fight back against conservative dominance in politics all this while?
Look, what we're trying to tackle in today's debate is those societies that don't have any room for discussion. This is what the debate is about. We think that they're debating on the grounds where room is available for discussion. We don't think this is what the debate is about. They're still banking on the wrong characterization. They're never going to win today's debate. So let's look at a few justifications on why we should pass this motion, right? So firstly, why change will never happen under their side, and secondly, why the government has the right to infringe and how the government should infringe in this situation. First of all, why it will never happen under their side? Because we think that there needs to be a strong external force to allow change, right? There needs to be a push, and we think that this is what we are allowing. We're allowing a politician to actually reach up there in power to actually push for policies that disprove this kind of discrimination and limits this kind of restrictions onto these minorities, right? We think there's a societal inertia that happens under their side when the society is already in the state where they don't accept for this discussion. They will not suddenly change and open up for this discussion unless they're being pushed to allow for this discussion. We think under this sort of discussion or awareness or understanding will never happen under their side because there's no reason for them, there's no incentive for them to change because they're always going to stay in that situation unless they're being changed, which is what we're doing, right? We think that the problem with their side is that these conservatives don't allow for these liberal beliefs to pierce through their veil, their conservative veil, and they don't allow for any sort of change. We think this is harmful because it causes harms towards this minority, right? We think we can show you a clear example where states actually do policies without looking at the beliefs of the majority, like when Ohio legalized the gay marriage. It was the first gay marriage legal in the states, and we think that it wasn't due to a referendum. We think it was court that reasoned based on merits and demerits, disregarding the majority beliefs. And then how is this beneficial? Because this court actually legalized this marriage based on logical reasoning, not the majority beliefs. We think this is harmful under their side, right? We think that the problem with conservative society is that there is no education or understanding for these progressive beliefs, and we think that the problem is these beliefs are not necessarily the only correct thing, and we think that we need to change it, especially when it harms the minorities. But secondly, why does the government have the right to infringe? We think there are two reasons. One, because there exists the harm principle here, and secondly, because at the end of the day, our side achieves the greater good, right? So let's look at the harm principle. We think that when your rights or your beliefs or action curtails the rights of others, we think that the right or the action was not legitimate to begin with. We think this is exactly what happens with the religious dogma under these conservative societies, because they're actively oppressing and suppressing these minorities. So we think that then when this dominant narrative actually controls the society and harms the minority, we think that the government has the mandate to actually step in and infringe for the greater good, because this majority is already harming the minorities, right? So it leads me straight to my second analysis: why under our side the government is legitimate, and why the government has the right to infringe. Because we achieve the greater good at the end of the day, right? We think this is more of a utilitarianism approach, because eventually our side leads to a higher likeliness of acceptance, because a more logical and liberal politician takes place and creates policies based on logical reasonings and not this religious beliefs, right? We think that simply because this is simply effective because society looks to the court for legitimacy. When this state and this courts actually legitimize a certain action, this is when the society will soon accept it and soon legitimize this sort of actions also, and this sort of acceptance, right? So we think that's one. We have to draw an example when information can actually be restricted. We think that information can be restricted depending on the merits and demerits of these actions. And we think in this case, there are merits to this situation, because at the end of the day, we're reducing the amount of oppression, we're reducing the amount of discrimination and poor quality of life that's provided onto these minorities, because they're not being able to live their life to the fullest, because the majority of these religious and conservative societies reject their ideas and don't allow them to be accepted into society. We think that we have enough of this discrimination into these conservative societies where there is no room for discussion, and this is why we're proud to propose. Thank you.
Right, we thank the speaker for his speech. We now invite the second speaker from opposition, the Deaf Leader for Opposition.
It is impossible for us to stand for minority oppression. It is impossible for us to say that autocratic regimes are necessarily a good thing. But what we can say in opposition is that it is legitimate if the country and the nation chooses to elect individuals who might be conservative, who might adopt conservative policies. I'm going to break the deadlock set up by proposition in two key questions today. First, what is the situation in conservative nations, and therefore whether it is necessary to implement the policy that side proposition chooses to follow? And second, assuming the worst case scenario of an autocratic nation on side proposition, what is the likeliest situation that is going to pan out in politics, and therefore is this legitimate, and whether this will bring about change when we engage even on the worst case scenario, which isn't really what we're talking about in today's debate anyway. So let me talk about the first question first. What is the situation in conservative nations, and is it necessary? Let us examine the logic brought forth by proposition. Essentially, the logic was simple. They started from the premise that conservative nations are religious. This meant that after that it would never change, and finally it meant that it was oppressive. Let me break this analysis in a few areas. First, let me break the premise of this analysis. It was premised upon the fact that conservative nations are religious. One, this is not true. We argue that there are many conservative nations that choose to adopt non-religious policies. Right? For instance, if I choose to support anti-abortion policies, there will still be considered a conservative stance, but not necessarily a religious one. We argue that unless they prove to us that all conservative nations are religious, this cannot stand as the de facto characterization for all conservative nations. No, thank you, sir. Arguably, in fact, we are willing to accept that there is a spectrum of conservative nations. Our side is being far more reasonable when we say that there are some conservative nations which are religious, and I will be engaging that later on, but we also have to recognize the conservative nations, they are also willing to accept discourse, they are also willing to accept change. And here's where I move on to the second rebuttal to their idea, right? Where I break the link between religion and therefore lack of change. First, we argue that there is already unveiling in even the most, as they characterize, the most conservative nations, like Saudi Arabia, as my first speaker talked about. Their rebuttal to that was public shaming. This, however, does not rebut the fundamental logic that there is an increasing platform for individuals to rise up and unveil and stand up against the government. No, thank you, sir. We argue that this doesn't clash with our argument in the first place. And of course, there will be initial stigma. You cannot claim that people will suddenly become liberal overnight. We accept that there might be shaming, there will be harm against individuals who choose to unveil themselves, but we argue this is good in the long run for gradual change or gradual discourse. No, thank you, sir. We argue it's not necessarily that religious means that you can never change. Second link I'm going to break, that because you never change, it therefore means that you're oppressive. That is just not true. Just because I consistently vote for the same politician doesn't mean I am oppressive. We don't think it's intuitively true that just because you don't change, it means they're oppressive. Don't you agree, sir?
When you want to talk about how these people are publicly shamed, right? We think because of this public shame, you are disincentivizing further liberal people from going out to
We have to look at this, right? It is a wash on both sides, insofar as there will also be giant amounts of inertia on their side. If a politician is going into office and saying, oh, actually, I lied about my position, I am actually a liberal, it is impossible for them to say that there will be no public shaming, there will be no public backlash. At best, it is a wash. Outside argues, no, thank you, sir, like gradual change from ground up is far better. But let me just break and conclusively destroy their characterization that you brought up in first, which I will now rebut is the warrant of this argument. Warrant of this argument is that because it's religious, because they will never change, because it's oppressive, it is therefore a bad thing. One, it is not always a bad thing insofar as you recognize the spectrum. Countries like Malaysia, for instance, where there is room for people to rise up, but arguably even if we take situations like in Russia, where arguably they are very conservative, there is still huge approval ratings for Putin in power, there is still huge approval ratings and mandate of the people given the politicians. Arguably we say that it is not always a bad thing if the people choose to do that. And here's where I move on nicely to the second question. Assuming the worst case scenario on their side, is it legitimate and will this lead to change? First, we argue it is not legitimate. And here's where their failure to deal with my first speaker's argument is fundamentally problematic. What did my first speaker bring to you? He told you that it is important to have the mandate of the people insofar as liberalism and conservatism are ultimately not only institutional issues but also societal issues. Which means that even if I change a policy, for instance, anti-discrimination against homosexuals or against women, if society does not accept these policies and if they choose to continue discriminating, there will be no change on the ground. If there is no mandate of the people, there is no change. So not only is it not legitimate because it harms the principles of democracy insofar as you're not providing equal representation, insofar as each vote is not actually a vote because you voted for a conservative conservative politician, but it turned out to be liberal, and finally it doesn't even work because there is no mandate for the people. But let us examine, thank you sir, the likeliest situation their policy will pan out in, and here's where we be very reasonable and argue even the worst case on their side. The likeliest situation they will pan out is very simple. It is not that I will suddenly have a prime minister or president that's liberal. This is not going to happen overnight. The likeliest situation is that there is going to be one or a few disparate politicians within the parliament that is going to be liberal. How will this impact in the long term the fight for liberalism? One, there will be huge intra-political backlash against liberalism, which will increase the rhetoric that is currently standing for conservatism. Why? Because now conservatives can paint these liberals as liars, these liberals as undermining the political process, as undermining democracy. That is how in the long run it will harm the fight against liberalism, insofar as liberals are now painted as the villains, insofar as they are painted as the enemies within politics. That is something my first speaker brought up that they failed to deal with. Well, thank you, sir. But furthermore, they also failed to deal with two other things. One, that the credibility of these individuals will be undermined insofar as the other people don't know what you're standing for. Because I don't know if you're standing for certain liberal policies or others. Because I don't know, because you never said it in your campaign, you only lie and say that you're conservative, your credibility will be undermined in the long run. And second, there will be a lack of strong support behind liberalism in the long run, insofar as we argue that liberals won't even support you in the first place because you fought for the elections as a conservative individual. We think you need the power and the backing of the liberal individuals within these countries in order to be able to push for any policies in the long run, in order to gain traction for liberalism. But lastly, I'm going to extend this and show you how this harms change towards liberalism in the long run. Because liberalism is not just liberalism in and of itself. It is a spectrum of things. For instance, it can be recognizing minority rights. It can be also recognizing certain other rights or economic liberalism. We argue that if there is a spectrum of liberalism that needs to be accepted. Insofar as we argue that different individuals might support different frontiers of liberalism, there is necessity for informed acceptance to be able to gain traction in the long run. So which means that if I'm willing to support minority rights, but I'm not willing to support economic liberalism, for instance, I should be able to make the informed choice. But insofar as every liberal politician is lying and saying, I'm conservative, I'm not supporting minority rights, I'm not supporting economic liberalism, we argue there is no such informed choice, there will be no informed change towards liberalism, even in their instance, even in their worst case scenario, we take today's debate.
Right, to thank the speaker for his speech, we now invite the final substantive speaker from the government team, the government debate.
When they argue that conservatism was a choice made by the people, we would like to question, why are you legitimizing and validating that choice when that choice actively suppresses, oppresses, and discriminates people on the ground? We don't understand why you are condoning that act and why you are allowing that act to happen. We take this debate right from the get-go. Let us analyze the characterization coming from both sides of the house, because we need to understand what necessarily constitutes to conservative societies and why we have already taken this characterization and why their characterization can never stand. Because they talked about the idea that number one, conservative societies want to be conservatives, that this was their choice to begin with, that they were given this mandate and they were given this right to make that choice. We don't understand why you are allowing these people to make that choice when that choice actively harms the people on the ground. When you continuously allow people to harm the gays, when you take away their rights, and when you continuously oppress the women, we think that this is very, very harmful. We think that you, on their side, condones the act of the harms, right? We need to understand what is harm in this sense and how these people are being harmed. We think that they never understood why it is harmful to necessarily choose to be conservative in nature, because now they're actively okay and they know and they're conscious about oppressing the people on the ground. Because since that conservatism was a choice that these people made, this choice was necessarily an active choice. That means that they are actively aware that they are oppressing the people, they are actively aware that they are discriminating against people on the ground. We think that this choice can never stand in today's debate. The response to that was this: guys, these people don't necessarily know that they've been oppressed, right? They don't necessarily know that they have been oppressed since this time, right? We think that that's very, very harmful. We don't think that that response is sufficient. Because if I were to rape a girl who is sleeping, and that girl doesn't necessarily know that she's being raped, we don't think that this harm can necessarily be condoned. We think that the harm still exists, and it is the duty of the government to be objective towards this harm, to tell you that it is harmful because you don't necessarily understand the magnitude of your harm. We think that this is very, very harmful under their side. Sure.
Sir, it is on your side that you argue that these people don't even know about oppression happening against them. We say that they know and therefore they will fight in situations where the harm really exists, really is bad. Who are you to say in a situation where they don't know that this is what is objectively true?
Look, the idea is this, right? If people were to know that they were being oppressed in the first place, we don't think that there would be call for this debate, right? But even if we were very there's the minority in this instance. The reason why these people are given a tag of a conservative society is because the majority of the people on the ground are conservative. We think that the harms exist even though you try to bring it down with a rebuttal that doesn't stand. Let us move on to the second idea, right? Because they argued that conservative societies are that are liberal in nature. They are conservative societies that are being liberal. But we think that the idea is this, right? Number one, they are being given the tag of a conservative society because that tag necessarily reflects what society on the ground is. Sure, we concede that there are people on the ground actively fighting for minorities, but we don't think that that is enough, especially when you have people on top continuously suppressing these people and continuously telling them that what you are fighting for doesn't necessarily condone to what the society necessarily believes. But then the response to that was quite odd. They gave you examples of Malaysia, that Malaysia is actively becoming more and more liberal because we have more and more oppositions trying to fight for. But look, we don't see the oppositions winning. Why? Because the majority of the people are conservative in nature. The majority of the people continuously support the government. And we think that when you continuously have that form of oppression and suppression, you are in a sense validating that very, very idea. But what was our proposal from the get-go? We think that you must always have that form of politicians and the form of representation right from the top, right? You must always be able to reflect what society necessarily is. But we don't think under these circumstances it works. Why so? Because the moment you allow politicians to reflect the majority, which is to reflect the religious dogma in society, you are harming the people, you are harming them as a whole. We are not willing to accept that burden. Next, the idea of alternatives, because they argue that there are alternatives that exist. That organic change will necessarily be the ultimatum in this debate. We don't think that is necessarily true, because the idea is this, right? Even if we were to accept that there are individuals in society who are starting to change, how long are you willing to wait? How many people are you willing to die in order for your certain policy and your certain mechanism to be placed in power? We think that that is very, very harmful. But let me disprove and let me break the link on how this will never actually happen. Because we think that these individuals are continuously suppressed by what society is. They are continuously coerced into placing that ballot towards that individual who is conservative in nature. And this leads me very nicely to the next issue, the idea of representation. Because they argue that we are undermining representation and that the people's votes aren't necessarily in power and we're not empowering that vote. But you have to understand how those people vote in the first place. These people vote based on teachings that they have been taught from a very, very young age. And this is the very, very teachings that we want to change the moment we place these politicians in power. You are not allowed to continuously entrench that idea that gay people don't have rights. You are not allowed to continuously entrench the idea that women should continuously stay in the kitchen. We think that this is very, very harmful. But the second level of rebuttal is this. We think that even though these people don't necessarily vote based on teachings, these people vote based on what the society and what the pressure on society is. We think that the idea comes down to this. The moment I as an individual find that I am a minority in a certain voting, we think that these individuals will be more than likely to want to follow what the majority is voting for. We think that the idea comes down to this. Why is it a dire necessity to have this, right? Because under their characterization, it is very, very true that liberalist politicians will never ever get placed into power. And for that very reason, we need to allow these people to lie. We need to allow these people to be placed in power first, and then structural change will happen. We want structural change. We want institutionalized legitimacy.
Right, we thank the speaker for his speech. For the final substantive speech on opposition, we now invite the opposition whip.
Essentially, the thrust of their case is that they accuse us of condoning oppression. Here's a very simple question, right? If this debate has ultimately boiled down in, say, for instance, case examples, where on one hand, religiousness says that homosexuality is wrong, and at the same time, other people believe in the freedom of sexual expression, and if both of these are legitimate religious/moral claims, who are we to decide who is right? Given that these are grey areas and these are moral assessments, we as third parties, both proposition and opposition, cannot arbitrate. The only solution is discourse. But that side harms discourse, and I'm going to prove this very simply in my speech today. Two questions. First, are their ends legitimate? And second, are the means effective? So first, what they did was they tried to prove a moral imperative to stop oppression, right? And they characterized this to be human rights atrocities. Firstly, we say there's a spectrum of conservative societies, right? You cannot immediately conflate conservative societies with oppressed societies. But even then, we think that sometimes the curtailment of various rights allows the nation to allow for larger rights. For instance, Myanmar was too liberal in allowing the freedom of allowing the freedom of social media. What happened then was that there was rampant hate speech, and immediately the government had to clamp down on this because this hurt the political process. So this is a conflation of conservative and oppressive societies. But here's where I go even further, right? We argue that ultimately, we're not talking about clear-cut instances, for instance, the right to life, but rather more tertiary rights. When it comes to these tertiary rights, right, this is often a grey area. There are several reasons why proposition cannot impose a value judgment on what is right. Firstly, because of this idea of cultural relativism. The West thought that it was always a bad thing for Kenyans and for Nigerians to go through FGM. But in 1956, the movement Negatia proved that people actually believe in this religious practice of FGM. Because you cannot impose an exclusively Western concept of rights on these societies, we argue that you as a third party cannot arbitrate what is right. And more importantly, for the second reason, if this is something that is so fundamentally ingrained in society, religion, then they'd rather die than to see these practices be eroded. We argue that this is something you must accept. No, thank you. So given that they cannot arbitrate this, and given that this is a grey area, what is the solution? The solution is discourse. Discourse through democracy, through logical reasoning. But this discourse is harmed at the moment you make false premises, at the moment you disallow people from determining the sort of policies you'll be placing in society, because now people can hide behind a veil of words within the election process. But this is the worst case scenario. Let's engage with the best case scenario. The best case scenario was about minorities and somehow this harm principle. There's a shifting characterization here between, on one hand, saying that these nations are religiously homogeneous, and yet at the same time saying in a nation where religion is so ingrained that homosexuality is wrong, there'll still be homosexuals. But even if we concede this, we never said that oppression was a good thing. All we said was that we can provide international amnesty, but you cannot use democracy as a legal system to push for this means. Why? For the very simple reason that democracy ensures the rights of individuals to determine their lives. The sanctity of democracy, which they have not rebutted, is as such. You allow people, through seeing which politicians best represent their interests, to vote for these politicians. And what is truly oppressive is when you disallow this right for individuals to determine their life, and to determine the sort of outcomes their nations strive towards. For all these reasons, we don't think that even in the best case scenario, their side is legitimate. Second question, are the means effective? Here's the problem, right?
we are very happy to concede that this is tokenistic, that you achieve power, no thank you, very quickly. The question is this: are you able to maintain power, especially since, as they said, religionists believe, no thank you, that you are using the sort of, that you align the people and therefore you're not legitimate. Given that religion is something that people would die for, we don't think that it is naive for us to suggest that the sort of public outrage that will get ultimately delegitimizes your government. And more importantly, we think that, no thank you, we think that ultimately, this is the sort of thing that we want to fight for, right? The fact that ultimately, the sort of objectives they're fighting for are not legal rights. If you talk about homosexuality, the true objective is the absence of discrimination. But these are societal conditions which people must genuinely believe in before their objectives can be truly fulfilled. That is why the only objective is for a lot of people to truly believe in these objectives. But you don't do this the moment you force them to accept a leader they do not accept. As Brian told you, the sort of rhetoric that you are villains, that you are harming people, ultimately harms this movement towards liberalization, because because you may have the mandate of institutions and of governments, but you definitely don't have the mandate of the people. And if people don't, no thank you, believe that homosexuality is right, then discrimination will never ever be absent. Before I move on, sorry, yes.
You argued that conservatives are okay with being conservatives, right? But then in the same breath, you then argue that there are people who are standing up against this conservatism. If organic change is so powerful on your side, then that means these people aren't necessarily okay with being conservatives in the first place.
No, sir, we're not talking about one particular nation where it is either this or that. We're talking about a spectrum of nations. So for instance, in Malaysia, we see that while the majority are conservative, but even then we have to qualify this term conservative, there's a shifting movement towards political opposition that believes in a slightly more liberal stance. But at the same time, there are other nations that are homogeneously conservative. So for instance, Saudi Arabia. And it is in these nations we argue that ultimately discrimination against your objectives will still occur. They said, oh, these politicians will be able to justify their position in parliament based on logical reasoning. Here's the problem. On one hand, you say that people believe in religion, and at the same time you say that they can be persuaded by logic. At the point where the only justification for oppression is because God says so. We don't think that this is something that is particularly effective, especially since, as you characterize it to be, this is religion and not logic. Finally, they say, organic change won't occur because people are socially conditioned to vote this way. Here's what we say. On your side, you can achieve power very quickly, but your ability to maintain power is ultimately questionable because the sort of political capital you need to be able to legitimize the government is lost at the point where people don't believe in a government. But more importantly, this idea about social conditioning is a very generic argument because this is not exclusive to religion. We are affected by so many conditions all the time at the ballot box. For instance, our personal beliefs, for instance, our background. Here's the problem. You cannot say that religion is wrong. You cannot say that people, because they vote for religion, are not voting legitimately. And this is something that you cannot impose because what is important to people should be up to them to decide. So because ultimately, their side achieves power very quickly, but cannot maintain this power, and ultimately, because they cannot impose value judgments on what is right, we need to allow discourse and therefore democracy outside stands.
Right, we thank the speaker for his speech. As is traditional, we now move to replies. We invite the first reply from opposition.
Mr. Speaker, side proposition's case for supporting liberals is a case which opposes oppression. But at the point where the third speaker from proposition mischaracterizes our entire case as supporting and legitimizing oppression, we think that they cannot take today's debate because they need to show us, one, why conservative politics is always illegitimate and your liberal policies are always legitimate. Two, how you would derive that sort of legitimacy. Three, how you maintain it give people that choice and maintain it at the end of the day, ensure that people actually garner that sort of choice, which is why they would then oppose oppression, right? The antithesis to oppression is choice. It is not liberalism, it is not progressive politics. Our case was never to support oppression. What did we say? We told you that on their side, it is never always objectively beneficial because there are issues such as abortion, etc., which can only be determined when you let people make an informed choice for themselves. From first speaker, they asserted that people do not know what's best for them, they do not know when they are being oppressed. We tell you that it's only when they know, and they do know, that they can actually make a choice, which is why Saudi Arabian women want to drive, which is why Iranian women are unveiling online, right? They do know, then they want to make the choice, that is when that choice is legitimate. Therefore, on this basis, how then does their side really achieve informed choice? We told you that their sex policy is illegitimate, and the debate was about policy, not about oppression, because ultimately it's a specific debate here, right? Because at the end of the day, on their side, they are able to provide any sort of informed choice to the people. They are able to provide them with a choice to choose in election when you're deceiving them and telling them that I'm supporting this oppressive policy that you are voting for. And therefore, at the point where they do not have the mandate of the people, they undermine any sort of legitimacy and mandate that their side has. These progressive politicians see the mandate of the people in the face of like the mandate of God or the will of heaven, right? And that is why we say that this is so important for these people. They will undermine this, they do not get this. In fact, you also argue that no informed choice happens when ultimately like the media is controlled by the establishment, when you're unable to get your message out, right? Our alternative on our side was for these leaders not to deceive the people, but to fight for whatever they're fighting for, their message online, like social media, etc., right? These are tools increasingly available to them. They're not perfect, but increasingly, we see a groundswell of opposition, such as in Malaysia, against the traditional dominance of conservative politics. And it is only when we garner that sort of support, when people know and accept it, that we actually can change, right? That we can actually change like societal discrimination, which is the fundamental problem on their side of the house. What happens after these liberal politicians are voted in? What actually happens, right? Which they entirely dropped at the end of the day. You only have change for a few days. There's huge backlash from the religious establishment, from maybe the Ayatollah or the supreme leader, from the media, which is controlled by the conservative establishment, from the courts, from the rest of society, right? From the religious establishment. And that is why they'll be removed from power, they are unable to maintain it, they will be accused of being liars, of deceiving the people, they are unable to maintain that sort of support. On their side, they don't even have the organic change, because these people did not fight for it on social media, the leaders instead deceived the entire people by running for an election under the guise of a conservative politician. At the end of the day, they are also unable to achieve any sort of meaningful change once they get in. People are confused. They are unable to convince people that what they are fighting for is truly what they want, right? Because their side argue that people don't know what they are fighting for, yet they place a value judgment, say that it's legitimate, and at the end of the day, they are also unable to achieve any sort of real change because there will be huge backlash, because they are not legitimate, because they only entrench that kind of fear and paranoia within the traditional establishment. We are very proud to say that their side's policy is not legitimate. In the face of oppression, they are able to change that oppression, they entrench their oppression, and that is why we are very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for the final speech of this debate at this Octo-Finals. I now invite the government reply.
What is a conservative society? Coming from government, we've given you a clear characterization. We've told you that a conservative society is a society where there's a majority of conservative people. There's highly influenced by religious dogma. There is less room for discussion because people are more willing to subscribe to the will of God rather than to the will of logic. But what is the response coming from opposition? The only response that they've basically given us is that they said some conservative societies are more liberal than others. We've already responded to that, right? Firstly, we've told you how they are ignoring the majority of conservative societies. In other words, they're implicitly conceding that, that in those places, these kind of problems do happen, but they keep trying to fight for the more liberal ones. But secondly, even if they keep talking about the more liberalized conservative societies, right? We've also responded to that. Because if you want to tag a society as conservative, it means the majority of the people in the society have to be conservative. It means that the majority of people in society are unwilling to accept that women have equal rights. The majority of society are unwilling to accept that LGBT is somehow a right thing, is somehow a good thing, and that we should respect this LGBT. If they want to keep arguing that conservatives are okay with discussion and willing to listen to logic, then that is no longer a conservative society, ladies and gentlemen. They keep arguing that the conservatives are okay with being conservative, but then they want to argue that organic change is going to happen, right? It means that if organic change is really so effective on that side, that means the society isn't so conservative after all. Because conservative basically means we resist change. When you want to talk about how people are more willing to change, they are arguing from the perspective of a liberal society. They are not engaging our case. We think that we already won this characterization. But let's look at the outcomes of both sides, right? Because they try to engage in our characterization of a true conservative society. They said that it's not going to happen overnight. In my first speech, I already conceded that, right? They said that there was going to be societal backlash, that there was going to be intra-political backlash. We never contested that. We agree that people won't be happy in the first place for the very reason that they are conservative. But we argue that this is absolutely necessary, because if we don't put the impetus for change, if we don't change it from the government, society is never ever going to change. Their side continues to oppress people. But then they keep coming to argue about how organic change is going to happen. We have sufficiently responded to that. We've told you how when, for example, right, if they want to keep harping on this example of Saudi Arabia, women unveiling themselves, we've already responded to that by telling you how these women were shamed by the media of their country, were publicly humiliated. Firstly, this disincentivized any liberal politicians from coming out and saying that they are liberal because they fear the same public humiliation by the conservative majority. But secondly, if they want to argue that this organic change is so effective, then we wouldn't be having this debate in the first place. We are debating this because there is such a dire necessity to do this, because there is no other way to do this. Coming from our side, we provide the change. They say they don't oppress. But they also misrepresented us, right? They said that liberalism is always good. We didn't say that. We said that freedom is better than oppression, something that we need to all agree to. They also said that it was somehow the choice to choose in an election. We responded by saying the choice never existed, because as soon as politicians reveal they're liberal, they will get voted out. They will never get voted in. These minorities will never get representation in parliament, because under their side, they are furthering, they're ossifying the oppression of the minorities. They're rejecting the organic change. For all these reasons, we're proud to win this debate.
Across the floor, shake hands. Thanks for being here. Thank you.